Hello, whippersnappers. This is Mr. Fredericks, ready to talk about Harry Truman and his time as president. But it's really more of a look at the United States through Harry Truman's eyes. So we use him as a little bit of we'll just use him to basically try to figure out what went wrong and right with society and see if we can emulate that today. So let's go back in time to kind of see where Mr. Truman started. In 1884, he started in the great state of Missouri, and he was a baby, cute baby at that, apparently. And his journey was complicated. Very complicated. He started out as a farmer, but some time went by and he started working as a haberdashery. Now, that basically is a men's store of clothing and whatnot. You can see him on the left there with glasses. And over time, he joined the military because that was done quite at a higher percentage back then. If you wanted to go into politics, one way to do it was to join the military. And in 1929, the Great Depression struck. So in 1934, he said, you know what? The best way that I can help my country is to go into politics. That way I can pass laws to help people. So he joined the U.S. Senate in 1934. He slowly worked his way up to become a leader in the Democratic Party. And in 1928, again, we had Hoover elected, and then 32, FDR. So he's going to kind of be in that Democratic group under FDR. And FDR is going to get elected, three times. And then in the fourth time, 1944, FDR is going to have an election, and he dumps his vice president because his vice president is starting to actually oppose a lot of the things he was doing. So he dumps his vice president, Henry Wallace, and kicks him out. And Henry Wallace is actually going to run against him, but that's not important. At this point, FDR was looking. Henry Wallace was so liberal, and the Democratic Party, to help him defeat the Republicans, wanted a more moderate candidate that would appeal to moderates and kind of Republicans. Because if you can do that, you're going to get elected. So FDR wanted a running mate that could be more appealing to those middle voters, and so he picks Harry Truman. So in 1944 election, you now have FDR and Harry Truman running, and the Republicans put up a guy named Thomas Dewey. And the winner of this little battle is going to be Harry Truman and FDR. They're going to win that race. And it's out of the four races, it's going to be the least dominant race of FDR's time. But that said, he still won it. And in 1945, Harry Truman is vice president. 3 months goes by. He has that job for 3 months. And on April 12th, 1945, Harry Truman gets called to the White House. And Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of FDR, says that FDR has died. And we knew that was happening, but this is their famous conversation. Harry, she told him, one arm across the shoulder. The president is dead. Too stunned to speak for a moment, he finally asked, is there anything I can do for you? Is there anything we can do for you? She replied. For you're the one in trouble now. And that's that famous quote, for you're the one in trouble now. And he would be in trouble. Certainly the hardest job in the world, right? So at this point, in 1945, Harry Truman is now the president of the United States, filling out the last 3 years of FDR's term. Really 4 almost. But so the group of reporters at this point meet the new president, President Harry Truman. If you ever pray for me now. I don't know if you fellows have ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. Another famous quote. So was President Truman a good president? He certainly was intimidated by the job at first. And every segment of our population and every individual has a right to expect from government a fair deal. That's what he said. So the press are going to dub all of his ideas part of the fair deal. Every president tends to have a name that they apply to all of their ideas. So Harry Truman is going to be the fair deal, and we're going to look at the fair deal and everything that Harry Truman wanted to offer the American people. So decision number one that Harry Truman was making, and of course we're studying his decisions to see what we can learn from them for our present. So decision number one. In 1776, the United States was a very inequitable place. Businesses and rich dominated, and poor people were treated pretty poorly. Lots of abuse, right? Our society was dominated by the rich that dominated the poor. So money is going to be a huge factor. The rich are going to have tons of it, and the poor are going to have almost none of it. For 150 years, things finally started to get better. In 1935, we had what was called the Wagner Act. And the Wagner Act is going to legally allow workers to unionize. And that's going to give workers and laborers power to basically ask for more money and better working conditions. And that type of collective bargaining from the Wagner Act is going to lead to better negotiations, which creates a little more equity. Now, it's never going to be perfectly equitable, but it's going to be much better than it was. So it's also going to guarantee that unions can exist, and therefore they could go on strike in order to create that equity, and that was important. It's going to make workers a lot more powerful, and that's a lot of power to the people, and that's a good thing. But in 1950, railroad workers in the United States got angry. They thought they were working too much and they thought they were getting too little pay. So they go on strike. And that's going to upset much of the country, including Harry Truman. And the reason why the United States was scared about these railroad workers who have unionized now and going on strike is because they're the ones that ship supplies. If they go on strike, no supplies are going around the country. Airplanes were not as big of a thing back then. And that meant that businesses couldn't get the products they needed to sell. So if railroad strikers are on strike and railroads aren't operating and resources aren't going around the country, businesses will suffer. And it'll be thousands of businesses that could potentially go out of business without these products to sell. And that's a sad thing. So Harry Truman ordered the railroad strike unions not to strike. And he told them they can't do that. Now, can a president tell a strike not to happen? Weirdly enough, that according to the Wagner Act and other laws, there are two industries that presidents can tell not to strike, and that's airlines and railroads. Because the idea is that those two industries, if they go on strike, they can destroy our economy. It will impact every business, and that is not an okay amount of power for workers to have, according to these laws. In fact, Harry Truman threatened, if you don't stop your strike immediately, railroad union, then I will send the army to take over your railroad, and that will take all the power away from you, and that will destroy your union. So either way, the workers would lose power. So this kind of pressured them to accept a compromise, and that basically meant accepting a much worse deal, less money, more working hours, and that was the impact the president had on that union. So again, should the president have the power to shut down strikes of airline and railroad workers? Do we want in our society the president to have that type of power, which weakens those workers, those unions? And a lot of people don't want unions to be weak in that way. So that's only a question that you can answer, right? So problem number two in American society, because the government still has the power to shut down those strikes, is the United States, of course, has always been inequitable, rich over the poor, businesses over labor, and the poor have often suffered, right? They haven't had homes or property, they've been homeless, and we have such a huge homeless population. And it's not just chronic poor, it's people that lose jobs, and the children are homeless too. It's a very sad thing. So in 1937, FDR actually passed what was called the Housing Act of 1937. It basically said that when it came to the poor and the homeless, the government would start creating public or subsidized housing for the first time ever, where depending on how poor you were and how low income you had, the government would pay a percentage of your apartment or mortgage in order to give you a place to stay so you could afford, so you're not homeless. 12 years goes by in 1949, and the government got rid of the Housing Act of 1937. It basically expired. So there was no more subsidized housing in our society. People were on their own again, which meant that a lot of families were going to be homeless. So, I mean, there was not money going to them. Affordable housing was getting shattered. So in 1949, FDR is long dead, and Harry Truman is president, and he proposes the National Housing Act of 1949. This is like 12 years later. It actually expanded the subsidized housing and is going to pay even more money towards people that can't afford living and paying a higher percentage of their rent. So decision number two that I want you guys to consider, should the US government supply subsidized housing to vulnerable populations? Should it pay 50% of people's rent, 80% of people's rent when they don't have a job? Or should it let them fend for themselves and often turn out homeless? And Harry Truman is going to pass a law to create subsidized housing. Also, FDR did that before him. And I'm asking you, is this a good program for society to do, paying for people that aren't working? Problem number three, cities are beautiful if you've ever been to them. But if you look really, really close, a lot of times cities have a lot of poverty. Certain parts of cities are considered slums. They're overcrowded. Their living conditions are like three families living in confined spaces. There's massive crime to prey on the vulnerable, and it's really not aesthetically pleasing. It's very disgusting there, and people are living in tough shape. Harry Truman knew this, and he, as part of the National Housing Act of 1949, was not just subsidized housing, but also a lot of money to basically clear out slums in major U.S. cities, tear them apart, bulldoze them down, get rid of them, and then rebuild them up into very nice looking places and making them beautiful. This sounded like a great goal, clean up the slums of our cities to make them wonderful. And if you look here, it basically takes down bad cities to make them look nice. And this is progress. It's making America look a lot better, which is awesome. But the problem is when you take down those slums and rebuild them, the places are a lot nicer and rents naturally go massively higher for all those building communities because now they're nicer places. And all those people that were somewhat poor and vulnerable can't afford to live there, and they now have to flee the cities to find a much further away place that's cheaper. It's basically pushing people out of cities, particularly poor and people of color, in order to make room for much wealthier people, often very white and privileged. And that is what these laws will do. So it's basically kicking people out of their homes. And there's a fancy word for this gentrification. As we do urban renewal programs and tear down slums and replace them with nice places, it kicks people out of their home. So there's a lot of good to this, making cities nicer, but it's also bad for the people. So is this fair or unfair that we're kicking people out of cities to make the cities economically nicer? So my decision is, should the US heavily invest in urban renewal to fix cities up, to make them significantly nicer, if that results in higher rents and people of color and vulnerable populations being kicked out of there so that people that have money can now live there, often very white? Is this progress for cities in our country, or is this racism for urban renewal and terrible? Only you can decide, right? Problem number 4. In 1935, there was the Wagner Act, right? So that created something called the closed shop. What it was it made it illegal for unions to get agreements where they're basically, businesses could only hire from unions. For every job, they had to hire a union person. That's called a closed shop. That the shop, the workplace, was closed. Only union workers could work there. This gave unions an unbelievable amount of power because only workers, if the business wanted to hire somebody, they had to go to the union to supply somebody. And that meant the business relied on the workers, right? So in the 1940s, closed shops created by the Wagner Act resulted in a record number of strikes because workers had a lot of power. If businesses, if businesses, if workers felt that they were underpaid, they would just go on strike because they had 100% of the workers. Businesses couldn't then go hire other people to weaken the unions. So life is going to massively improve for workers because they had more leverage. They could go on strike because they could completely shut businesses down because all the workers, 100%, were union based because of the Wagner Act, right? And the closed shop rule. So businesses were weaker because, again, there was a lot more leverage for the unions. So prices would go up because businesses would have to pay workers more and raise their prices. That hurt consumers and so on. So in the end, a lot of people were going to complain because workers, now that they were closed shops because of the Wagner Act, you couldn't get hired unless you joined the union. And when you join a union, you have to pay these expensive union fees. And so a lot of workers were upset that they couldn't get jobs unless they joined the union. And of course, businesses were upset because now they were completely controlled by unions because unions had all the power. So a lot of workers were upset because the unions had so much power they could force a strike, even if some workers didn't want to go on strike. A lot of workers that were more conservative they didn't like that their unions, which they were forced to be a part of, if they wanted to work at that company, the unions would give political contributions to political parties that they didn't always support. So in 1947, the government passed the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act is going to take a big bite out of the Wagner Act, and it made it close shops completely illegal. And why illegal? Because people were like, closed shops give unions too much power. If 100% of all the workers for a business are union, the union then can control everything, can go on strike easily, and businesses would be hurt. So now that the Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947, businesses could hire non-union workers, and that meant unions were smaller. And if less workers at a business were in unions, that meant unions had less power. They couldn't go on strike as easily because even if unions went on strike, there were still workers behind that would keep working, and that meant the businesses could keep making money even during a strike, and that made unions less powerful. Unions would be weaker, workers would be weaker, and that hurt, right? So particularly if they gave workers less bargaining power. So in the end, the Taft-Hartley Act was aimed at making unions weaker and businesses stronger. And Truman was a supporter of unions and wanted unions to be stronger, so he actually vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act. But Congress overruled it because they were sick of unions being unbelievably powerful as they had been in the previous 10 years. Strikes happening all the time, businesses being weaker, prices going up. So in the end, the Taft-Hartley Act is going to pass. And closed shops are illegal and have been. So now there are no longer closed shops in our economy that businesses can hire union or non-union, and that makes unions weaker. And that's why less than 10% of our society are part of unions today. So either way, you should have an opinion about whether closed shops should exist. So in our society, is it better off if businesses can only hire workers from the local union? That means 100% of the workers for businesses will be union. That will give the union more power, and that will, in theory, make society a little more equitable between workers and businesses. But it does hurt businesses. So do you support closed shops, that businesses can only hire workers from unions? Very complicated, I know. Problem number 5, beyond closed shops. In 1947, the government passed the Taft-Hartley bill, which actually made closed shops illegal, but it did other things too. Another aspect of the law is that workers, if they plan to go on strike, which is going to help workers out, right? It's going to hurt businesses. The U.S. president can order strikes on any industry to stop for 60 days. So if a union wants to go on strike, the president can say, nope, I'm pausing your strike for 2 months, 60 days. The justification is it gives more time for negotiation. The president then can say, listen, the strike hurts everybody. I want you guys to take 60 more days to negotiate. So maybe you can come up with a deal and before a devastating strike occurs. It also creates a cooling off period. You guys are so angry right now. You're ready to go on strike. Let's take 60 days off so that you guys can cool down, and then nicer heads will prevail, and maybe you can come up with a compromise. So that said, it turns angry people into happy people. Now, but it makes sense. It almost says that the Taft-Hartley Act, the president having the power to shut down strikes for 60 days is a good thing, right? But there was evil intent. What it basically did was, if workers are about to go on strike, they can hurt businesses by basically making the business not profitable for 60 days. That gives the workers huge leverage to get a better contract for its workers. But now businesses in those 60 days, if a president says that strike can't happen, can stockpile goods, and they can keep more goods so they can keep selling at the beginning of the strike. And if they can keep selling, that means they're going to keep making money while the workers are on strike. And that means they're less likely to give in to union demands, even if the union is on strike. And that makes unions less powerful. So the Taft-Hartley Act banned closed shops, which makes union less powerful, but also that 60-day cooling off period of you have to delay your strike is going to make unions less powerful because businesses can still make money while a strike is going on. So decision number 5, is our society better off if the president of the United States has the power to shut down strikes for 60 days to basically give more time for negotiation before strikes occur? And maybe yes, maybe no. Problem number 6. From 1776 to 1948, African American soldiers were segregated even in our military. They were not allowed to be in combat positions. They were mostly stewards or cooks or butlers. They received lower pay for the exact same work. In 1948, Harry Truman said enough is enough. He issued Executive Order 9981 because Congress wouldn't pass a law banning segregation in our military. And in that executive order, it said segregation gone. In our government and our military, no more segregation. Black troops could serve along white troops. But our generals were unbelievably angry. They thought that by allowing African Americans to serve in the military, it was a national security threat. It was going to hurt our country. It would hurt recruiting. White people would not want to be in a military that was desegregated. They didn't want to serve along African Americans. They thought it would create fighting in the military because white people hated black people hated white people, and there'd be more fighting, and that would create a lot of problems in the military. Group cohesiveness is a vocabulary phrase. This is what the general said, that in order to be in the military, soldiers had to depend on the soldier to the left and right to live, to protect each other. And if you couldn't get along with those people, you weren't going to trust them, and that's going to make our forces significantly less of an effective team. Group cohesiveness would struggle. So most Americans at this point were against integration, and Truman said, I don't care. I'm going to do the unpopular thing, and I'm going to order it right now, and he did. So the government desegregated in 1948, and so did the military. Politicians at this point typically do what their people think is right because they want to get elected. However, so my question is the job of a politician to do what the people think is right, which at that time was against segregation, or do they do what they think is right? Harry Truman thought segregation was wrong. So my question is, what is the job of a politician? To do what the American people think is right who elected them, or to do what they think is right and to serve their own personal ideals? So is an elected official's job to do what they think is right, or to do what is popular among their voters? Harry Truman will desegregate segregation, and that went against what the American people wanted. But I would argue it's a good thing. So what is their job? To do what they got voted in to do, or to do what they themselves personally think? And only you can answer that question. So problem number 7. The United States has always been a society that's been inequitable. Rich people are much more powerful than so many poor people. Well, in 1948, the minimum wage came up as an argument. Basically, it was 75 cents. And Harry Truman said, that's just so awful. I want to raise that to $1. Now, business owners are often greedy. They don't pay their workers hardly anything. And if workers quit because their salary is low, everywhere else is paying them terrible salaries too. So they can't get a job anywhere else for anything better. And it's just this huge collusion of all the business owners to pay workers terrible. So the people need help, and they're not getting a fair, sustainable salary. So only the government can do it. So the government, so again, the government basically, if they want, they can force businesses by passing a minimum wage, forcing businesses to lose their freedom and telling the businesses they have to pay the workers a certain amount. Now, is a minimum wage an abuse against freedom? Should business owners be allowed to pay their workers whatever they want? And some people argue that no. If you force businesses to pay their workers more, they're not gonna lose that money. They're just gonna raise their prices, and all consumers will be hurt by that inflation. So decision number 7: should the president ensure the minimum wage is strong and high and raise it if it's not, to ensure that workers make a certain amount of money? Or is that going to hurt businesses and it's unnecessary to begin with? Only you can answer that question. So Truman is going to raise the minimum wage, but problem number 8: 331 million Americans, population's about that, a little higher now, would get sick. So anyway, now when they get hired by a business, Harry Truman thought that that business should give them health insurance, right? And that's often exactly what happens. When Americans got sick, they would get health insurance from their business. The business would pay to send them to doctors when they were sick. And that's actually what I have. I work for the Braintree Public Schools, and they pay for my health insurance. And when I get sick, I go to the doctor, and Braintree pays like 60% of that. So anyway, and people get treatment, and that's a good thing. But when you're unemployed, you don't have a business to pay for your health insurance. And often people can't afford health insurance and they get sick. They don't go to the doctors. And when they don't have health insurance, that's really, really sad. People feel alone. They go to alone. They can't afford doctors, and they get even more sick than they would have if they went to the doctors early on to have that sickness cured. Well, in 1948, Harry Truman came up with an idea, and it was that health insurance should be national. The whole country should have it. They shouldn't have to have a job or rely on their business to pay for it, because some businesses don't have a lot of money. Health insurance should be a right, not an employment privilege, because we always have like 5% of our population without a job. During the Great Depression, it was 25%. So anyway, this is just another example of inequality, because rich people can afford health insurance, whereas poor people can't. So again, the idea here is that our government should be able to provide health insurance to everybody, regardless of how much money they have. National health insurance. So anyway, the government rejected Harry Truman's idea and said, no, we're not going to give national health insurance. And my question for you is, in 1948, Harry Truman wanted national health insurance. Should health care be a working privilege or a national right? A lot of people like it shouldn't be a national right. You should have to work for these things. Working people paid for taxes, and those taxes shouldn't go to pay for health insurance of people that are non-working. Other people are like, no, we shouldn't be petty about this. Everybody has the right to get medicine if they're sick. Only you can answer that question. Problem number 9: government helps people in the U.S. All the times. They pave the roads. They set up the schools. They take care of people that are criminals and lock them away. They pay for the fire department. They pay for trash pickup. They pay to remove snow. In the end, it costs a massive amount of money to do all those things. The government at the time in 1940s would get money through taxes, including through a poll tax to pay for these things. Now, what is a poll tax? When you go to vote, you often have to pay money to vote. And all of that money from all 331 million Americans goes to pay for all these things. So that's just one way the government gets money, right? And that's a good thing. So the government can do things with that money. But the South was forcing its people to pay high poll taxes, and as a way to keep poor people from voting. They were using it to keep the lower classes from voting, because lower classes, particularly people of color, wouldn't want to pay a poll tax because it was too expensive in order to vote, so they just wouldn't vote. And now you had wealthy people of privilege voting, and they were electing wealthy people, of privileged people into all the leadership roles. And this law of poll taxes, Harry Truman wanted to pass a law that banned poll taxes so that everybody could actually vote and they wouldn't be held back from poll taxes. But the government rejected this and said, no, we're keeping poll taxes because it raises a ton of money and we have a ton of services to pay for. And truthfully, the South was using it to keep African Americans from voting so that society could continue to pass laws that were unfair to African Americans and so on, and keep African Americans from voting. So ultimately, my question is, if the government needs money, is it acceptable to raise money by charging people to vote? It raises a ton of money to provide a lot of services that people need. But at the same time, it was being exploited in the South to prevent poor African Americans from voting. So in the end, if you were Harry Truman, would you have tried to ban the poll tax, a way that our government got a ton of money, but also used to prevent African Americans from voting? How do you handle that? Again, only you can answer it. Problem number 10, by the way, the poll tax would continue until 1963. Harry Truman would not successfully ban it, and the South would continue to use it to prevent African Americans from voting, which of course kept African Americans from having politicians and often white Americans from seeking their vote and keeping racist laws. Well, in 1950, the Republican Party was angry. They were angry at FDR, and because he got elected 4 times, and he was so powerful that nobody could defeat him no matter what. So he wasn't even qualified to be president in the end. He was so old and sick, he was going to die very soon. There's no way FDR should have got elected, but he was so powerful, and so many people loved him that he did get elected. So the Republicans wanted to pass the 22nd Amendment to our Constitution to basically say that from now on, we need to prevent politicians from getting way too powerful, and say they can only serve for so long. Because when you serve, you gain so many friends that the friends are willing to do anything for you, and that's a lot of power and leverage. So to prevent anybody from getting too powerful and obstructing freedom, we're going to pass the 22nd Amendment saying presidents can only serve for 2 terms. Now, a lot of people are against the 22nd Amendment because they think people should be free to elect whoever they want. The 22nd Amendment shouldn't get in the way of electing the person they love. So my question for you is, should presidents be allowed to get elected for more than 2 terms? People should be free to elect them for as many terms as the people like them. Or should we limit the power that candidates can get by saying, no, you can only get elected for 2 terms? So only you can answer that question. Now, was Truman a good president? Well, in 1948, he ran for president after serving for about 4 years, 3.5. And he ran against Thomas Dewey, who lost to FDR. Now he's going to go against Truman. And everybody thought, a big survey of 50 writers out of 50, believed that the Republican Thomas Dewey was going to win that election. Harry Truman was definitely going to lose. So Harry Truman, in response, goes on a whistle-stop tour. He goes on the back of a train, and he travels across the entire country. You can see where he went, everywhere. And he gave over 200 speeches, and that is going to win people to his side because they liked hearing him speak. He also was the guy that ended World War II by dropping 2 atomic bombs, and people liked him for that. He also, at the beginning of the Cold War, kicked the Soviet Union out of Iran by getting tough with them, threatening them. He also saved Greece and Turkey from turning communists with the Truman Doctrine and giving them $400 million to build up their militaries to put down those communist revolutions. He also passed the Marshall Plan, which gave billions of dollars to the Western European countries to get them back on their feet so they didn't turn to communism. He also stood up to the Soviet Union that was trying to kick the Allies out of Berlin, and he did the Berlin airlift to stop the Berlin blockade and kept us in Berlin. And we would stay in Berlin for the next 40 years, and that saved Berlin and West Germany. Now, on the night, so Truman did lots of good things, but on the night of the election, everybody thought he was going to lose. In fact, Harry Truman even held up a newspaper the next day because the Chicago Tribune was so confident that Dewey, the Republican, was going to beat Truman. They actually printed the newspapers early with the headline, Dewey defeats Truman, because they knew that was going to happen. And here's Harry Truman holding up that newspaper being like, I told you I was going to win. Even the newspapers thought I was going to lose. And that was a big moment for him holding that up. But anyway, Truman is going to get elected. But over the next 4 years, he's going to desegregate the military, which made him unpopular. He's going to, the Soviet Union is going to get the atomic bomb. And why didn't Truman stop him? Truman's going to lose China to communism. They're going to have a revolution, and the Chinese nationalists are going to lose to the Chinese communists, and people are going to blame Truman for that. Americans are going to really hate Truman for that. Korean War is going to happen, and Truman's going to let the North attack the South, and Truman's going to have all that time in 2 years, and he's not going to be able to end that war or win that war. People are going to be angry. Truman is going to fire Douglas MacArthur, who's going to be the leader of our troops in South Korea. And people love Douglas MacArthur because he wanted to crush the Chinese who had invaded South Korea. But Truman fires him because Douglas MacArthur was so aggressive with the communists that Truman was worried that the Soviet Union was going to hop into the war, and Truman couldn't have that. So he fired MacArthur, and all MacArthur wanted to do was destroy the Chinese communists. And so when he was fired by Truman, people hated Truman for that. They wanted to impeach Truman for that decision. So 1952, the presidential election, Truman decides not to run because he was so unpopular he would have got crushed. And in the 1952 presidential election, World War II hero David Eisenhower is going to run, and he is going to crush it. And he's going to get elected. He's going to be our president for the next 8 years after Truman. He's going to have a long journey to go on. And so in this presentation, we studied Harry Truman and his presidency and all the decisions that he made. And there was a lot there. So hopefully we understood what Harry Truman did, and of course, whether he was right to do all the things that he did, and you should have an opinion on it. Thank you for tuning into this presentation and kind of a study of Truman and his times, and I'll see you for the next presentation. Thank you.